Welcome, everybody. This is Monday night. I believe this is the seventh week. And I'm going to start off. We're going to begin chapter 5. First of all, does anyone have any questions so far?
Good so far.
Okay, I got Mike, Preston, and Jeff are here, and I'm sure we'll see if maybe one or two more. But nevertheless, we're going to begin. Chapter 5. I'm going to begin by sharing the book with you. And I think you can see the book.
We can.
We're going to begin. Chapter 5 is going to discuss modulation, basic transmitters, receivers, and amplifiers, digital mode characteristics, power supplies, and batteries, it says. Well, let me begin by telling you a little oversight or a little preview by defining some things. Modulation is the means by which we replicate the characteristics of the audio that we send out. It is also the means by which we replicate certain digital techniques of sending information along. Modulation is essentially the way that we and by the way, there are various forms of modulation. We're going to cover them, many of them. There's some we won't cover because they're very rare to amateur radio and not on the test. But modulation is the way that we link intelligence to communicate that intelligence to the other side. And we're going to begin there. 5.1, it says modulation. It explains that a simple radio signal on the spectrum doesn't do anything. It doesn't communicate. It doesn't relay any information. It is essentially just a wave. It's not even a tone. We can make it a tone, but it is just a wave. And it carries no information. And I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to go back and forth here. That tone, that wave, is what we use for Morse code, the earliest form of communications in radio. We refer to it as continuous wave or CW because we really don't use Morse code. We use an international code, those that learn the code and operate in CW. And we don't modulate CW. We only send the wave itself, which is why CW is the narrowest of all the means of communicating on the radio. And to explain this to you, figure 5.1 here really does the job. An unmodulated wave, just a wave, just a sine wave. The difference between the dot and the dash is how long we send that sine wave in Morse code. Now, I'm going to jump ahead. This was the beginning of radio. It's all we had. In fact, it wasn't even this good. In the earliest days, they didn't even know how to make a good, clean sine wave. All they knew how to do is make static and interference. But eventually, the dream came along, oh, maybe we could send the intelligence of our speech by putting our speech or music or anything audio somehow onto the wave. And the bottom here is a representation on the right-hand side of a single sideband, of an AM wave. And I'm going to stop with the book here and go back to my terrible, awful drawing screen and do a little bit of an awful drawing. I think I'll find one that will make it it'll make it easy. By the way, it's a drawing I actually did. I'm not gonna save that drawing, am I? Let's look for the project. I want a wave. That's a wave, but that's not, and that's the wave I probably want. Sort of. Yeah, it is. I guess I will save that as picture. Apologize for this little delay. If you can imagine, I think I can't back that up. If you can imagine that this wave, right, going through here, crudely drawn, is the wave we're transmitting. The very first idea was the wave would stay the same, but we would change the amplitude, or how long or how powerful, how much energy the wave carried. So just for illustration purposes, I'm going to wipe out a bunch of this. In fact, I'll wipe it all out. What we decided to do was, well, we got to carry the information somehow. And so if we have a wave, and I'm going to leave that pretty color. If we have a wave traveling along an axis, simple wave. Now that wave, let me make that a color so that it's prettier. That wave all by itself is at a certain frequency. If we change the frequency of the wave, oops, that ain't gonna work. Let's try this again. We change the frequency of the wave. The way we do it is by compressing it or making more waves in a given period of time. The line we are on, the yellow line, is time. But the other line that's missing, and we're going to put that line in now for the sake of explaining things. If this were a graph, the other line that's missing, this line here, I don't know why it won't give me a straight line. I'll make that narrower, and I'll make that one yellow as well. Maybe a little wider. This line represents energy, power, or voltage. It represents how strong of a signal we're sending out on that wave. Now, we could make this wave, and I'm going to overlap it with another wave of another color, trying to get it as close to that wave as I can. And we'll make that color so we don't get confused, red. We could make this wave greater or lower in amplitude and still have the same frequency. Is that obvious? So if we made this wave fluctuate, while I'm trying to stay the same wave, but we made it fluctuate as I talk, and by the way, both sides of this would be fluctuating together while I talk, then we're on the same frequency, but we're changing the amplitude, how strong the signal is. And that is AM transmission or AM mode. I'll go back to the book, but before I do, you can kind of look at it like this. Imagine, if you will, I'm going to eliminate this that I just put in there. Imagine, if you will, I go back to an ink pen, and the drawing I had on there earlier, which looked confusing, was that we had a wave like this. Now, the wave will never pass zero until the same point, and it came back through zero again, the same point, but its volume was going up and down. It is actually the same frequency as this wave, but it's carrying information of our speech. That would be AM modulation, amplitude modulation. Okay, let's stop the share. I'm going to go back to the book. AM modulation was an offshoot of what to do next with this simple wave we were originally just turning on and off to send information via dots and dashes, or now international Morse code, international code. So now we'll go back to more in line with the book. A lot of people think of the AM as AM being a part of the radio dial because originally they really couldn't effectively use any frequencies above 200 meters, and 200 meters is about the top of the AM broadcast dial. And the commercial people won out. They got that for the original commercial radio band. Commercial broadcast is in roughly 200 meters, from something like 56 kilohertz to, or 560 kilohertz to, wait a minute, 5.6 kilohertz to 1.6, something like that. I forgot what it is. My mind's going blank on me. Guys, I gotta admit, COVID's playing heck with my mind since I had COVID. But anyways, we didn't get that. They gave us all the leftovers. Originally, ham radio operators had everything above 200 meters. So our first band was a 160 meter band, because actually the 200 meter band goes up to that point. The 200 meter commercial band, we got everything above theirs. So theirs ends at around 16 something kilohertz, 1610 or 1680, and ours starts just above it. We have from 18 to 2000 for the 160 meter band. It was once a very popular band, and AM modulation was the band predominantly used. Now, broadcast stations operate very wide AM. They swing back and forth to reproduce the whole audio spectrum. And so that you know, amplitude modulation, even within the ham bands, is the band that can best reproduce any audio. Why? Because you're only increasing the amplitude, the power, and not changing the frequency or bandwidth generally. So so the goal was we're going to use the amplitude of the signal, and in a minute we're going to cover how that's done. Okay, so got through that amplitude modulation. I'm hoping for a drawing. Here we go. I would use this one. So what happens is we're carrying the information in between the wave, and this illustration isn't all that great. Okay, they're trying to show you that this is the changing information. But really what it tries to illustrate is that, and we use this, but it's not accurate as it should be. With the drawing I kind of drew for you is the idea of the whole wave jiggling, moving up and down is more accurate, although we can display this particular envelope on a oscilloscope or a service monitor. This is showing us that there's an upper and lower, we'll call it a limit for just a second, of the wave. What it really is is there what we refer to as the sidebands. It's between the sideband and ground, or in zero, that the information is being carried. In an AM signal, it's being carried almost repeatedly. It reinforces itself. And AM has a fantastic quality because of that. Now, in the book a little further, and I'm going to hunt this drawing for you. In the book a little further, shows you what it looks like on a graphic display. And if this is our fundamental frequency, our sidebands are made of the information in between. This is the electronic reproduction of the audio wave being carried between the sidebands. It's I know it's not obvious. Let's see if I got a better drawing. Yeah, we got to go back to the first one to kind of give you that. It's interesting that the best drawing for all this is in the CW portion. So when we refer to, there's an upper sideband and a lower sideband and a carrier. The carrier is the fundamental frequency. The upper sideband and the lower sideband are defining the information, the voice, the sound. And that composes an AM signal. That's what it's made of. The way we get it is we basically control an oscillator with a waveform from an audio source that we've introduced, and we're going to get to that in a minute. So, but we're going to jump back a little bit. One of the great advantages of an AM signal is that it can easily be intercepted. Process of receiving an AM signal is called AM detection. And a simple diode will detect an AM signal. Wire hooked to a diode will bring in AM signals. Now, you need to clean that up because it brings them all in all at once, a long wire attached to a diode. But it will bring in an AM signal. And then we basically use a tuning circuit to clean that out. That's the makings of a very crude radio called a crystal radio. The crystal originally consisted of a crystalline material, even a rusty old old shaving razor blade. A Gillette razor blade that got real rusty will sometimes work real good. And a very fine stylus type pin, thin wire. Sometimes they would use a safety pin to build a crystal radio. And by moving the safety pin around the razor blade, or by moving an actual device made for the purpose called a cat whisker around a little pot of crystal, tiny little thing about the size of a button, you could pretty much find where it would detect signals. And sometimes you moved it around, you could change what signal it detected, but it was found that if you put a loop or a coil, a wire ahead of that and a capacitor to form a tank circuit, and then you either varied the capacitor with by having a variable capacitor, or you had the loop of wire arranged so that you could move where you made contact with that wire, you could tune the signal in because you were tuning the circuit. Remember we talked about filters earlier? A tuning circuit is a filter. So I'm going to take a little break in a second, but we're going to move on from this in a minute. Now, AM, like I said, has both the upper and lower sideband and the carrier wave. Okay. In a minute, we're going to discuss single sideband and the latest that hams use on the HF frequencies, and some people use on VHF and UHF. I have gear to do this. Single sideband strips out the unnecessary, and we'll get into that, to use the bare bones. But the advantage of AM signal is that an AM signal has the highest quality reproduction possible. We don't always do so. Too many hams overdrive it and don't get it. That's fine. But it is possible to do the best reproduction on an AM signal. The disadvantage is that it's always roughly 5 kilohertz wide, and that's pretty wide. A single sideband signal of almost 6 kilohertz to be more precise. Single sideband is half of that, and so we can get more single sideband conversations in the same space as an AM than we can 2 for 1 as an AM signal. So, there's a limited amount of lower frequencies, HF frequencies, that generals and above can use. But we generally try to keep as little use at a time so more people can operate on it. Some of the bands, the frequencies as technicians you're going to get right off the bat are about 1,000 times more than what's left to get on the HF frequencies from the general class and extra class licenses. And there are advantages to those frequencies. Number one, they are the frequencies that skip around the world best. But nevertheless, they're very limited in their size because they're so low in frequency that every band is much smaller. And we'll cover that in a minute. All right, we're going to move on. Now, in the drawing I drew for you, I drew a simple wave, and I kind of drew for you a preamble because I only showed you one half of what would be a AM signal, and that would be what is a single sideband signal. So going back to the text, this is a full AM signal with the sidebands carrying the information adjacent to the fundamental frequency, which is the carrier wave. We generate this wave, we generate the upper sideband, we generate the lower sideband. But in figure 5.3, this is what we do with a sideband radio station transmitter. We suppress one set of sidebands, the lower or the upper, depending on where we're operating. The rule in HF is that we usually use lower sideband up through 40 meters or 7 megahertz. 30 meters is a CW only band, and every band above that we use upper sideband all the way into the VHF, UHF spectrum and beyond when we're using sideband. So by removing the carrier wave and suppressing the sideband waves, which is essentially filtering all these out, we only send the upper, or maybe only the lower, but we only send the sideband with the information. Now, in an AM signal, the receiver centers or tunes on the fundamental frequency, on the carrier frequency. So its tuning is always precise. The audio always sounds very well reproduced. But if we're tuning a sideband signal, we've got to be right on the mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something I don't usually do for the class, but I will now, because this is important. I think I go Shift, Win, And I think I can pull this portion out and save it. And I'm going to stop, and we're going to go to share screen again. We're going to go back to the cool drawing I did. And once again, I'm going to destroy all my work. I'm just going to wipe it out. Boy, that was easy. And now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to paste in that image. And voila. Amazing. Now, I want you to imagine something. I'm going to grab a box so that I can illustrate something. A two-dimensional box. And when we tune an AM signal, we tune and it's the radio centers it automatically right to here. So it's all inclusive of the entire signal. So I think you could see, but with a carrier wave, if this wave was there, then tuning it's pretty simple. But we tune to the center wave and we've got this half and that half automatically on each side of the width of an AM radio receiver. But in sideband, we've got to tune it like this. All this, we don't need. It would distort everything. So as we're tuning, we've got some of the information, a little more of the information, a little more, a little more, a little more. Eventually, we got it tuned right in. If we go too far, we lose some. And each time we don't have it all, there's distortion. So as we're tuning, single sideband, and this is part of another chapter in operations, but we're going to get this all at once. In single sideband, as we're tuning, we need this little window of reception, which is the bandwidth of the frequency that we're receiving, of the signal we're receiving. Excuse me. As we're tuning, if we're a little low, voice, it gets really up there and we got too high and we get back down low. Sort of does that, but it's distorted a little differently. It's a little Mickey Mouse of a sound. And so sideband is more critical to tune. I also think you notice something now. When we're tuning on sideband, we're not actually tuning on the frequency. The reality is this drawing is wrong. My little box is wrong. But the reality is, because the box is too small, the reality is we're tuning above or below the fundamental frequency, essentially. And let me get rid of this box. Let me do a new box. And we're really tuning something like this. Now, but the way I had it earlier is probably easier to understand. You got to include all of the information until you get it right. This isn't all of it. That's not all of it. And the AM signal, because it's wider, will center on the AM signal. If the AM signal we're receiving too narrow, we wouldn't get real good reproduction here either, except what would be missing from here might be reproduced down here, depending on how narrow we're listening. If you try to listen to an AM signal with too narrow a filtration, it sounds very hollow. And you really don't have great sound, but you can still understand it quite well. With a sideband signal, We want to get all of the sideband, the one sideband you have. That's all the only information you got. All right, any questions on this before I continue on? Because I'm going to stop this share and go back to the book. Does it start to make a little sense about what the difference is between single sideband and AM?
I'm having trouble with it.
Okay.
The last minute and a half didn't make any sense to me. Can you describe the difference between AM and single sideband again, please?
All right. I'm going to go back to the drawing that, or the figure 5. I think it's 5.1 in your book, 5.2 in your book. This is an AM signal. Okay. There's a sideband that carries half the information. Well, they're actually repetitive of each other. There's an upper sideband and a lower sideband. They carry the information of your sound. The wave is moving up and down along this fundamental frequency. An AM receiver will reproduce this as normal sound quite nicely. And in a sense, we have doubled our money to make sure we've got every bit of the audio right there. As I drew in the drawing I did, I'm going back. Go back to drawings. I unfortunately closed the drawing, so I got to open a new one. All right. And share screen. This is not an easy concept, and that's why I'm going through this. Okay. Let's go to new. Oh, come on. All right. I have no idea what it's going to be named, but it's gone. In the sideband story, and paste this back again. In the sideband story, what we did, we got rid of half of this stuff and the carrier fundamental frequency. And we're only sending that, it's the same frequency, but we're sending the information itself, all by itself, the one sideband. And we're receiving it, just the one sideband.
Okay, now I'm getting it.
Because we're only getting the one sideband, we have to make sure that when we tune to it, that we get all of that sideband. We need all this information. Okay? Now, if I had this nice big window and it's somewhere in here, and this was an AM signal, this would be too narrow for the whole AM signal. But if this were an AM receiver and it had this narrow of a filter on it, it would get half the information here and the other half the information there. Because they're twins of each other in an AM signal. So we would copy it. It wouldn't sound as full or as rich, and it would sound a little hollow, but it would be intelligent. We could understand it. But if this were a sideband signal and we're a receiver and we're receiving a sideband signal, this gets distorted until we get all of the information. And we only have one side, one copy. Imagine that there's two copies in an AM signal and only one.
That makes sense.
Okay. It's just not really that there's two copies. What's going on is as we're modulating the upper sideband and the lower sideband. That's carrying the information along the center frequency, which is the carrier frequency. If we use a sideband radio to listen in, when we tuned right to the middle here, we would hear a tone. That tone would be it trying to reproduce the carrier of an AM wave if that was an AM signal and not a sideband signal. One of the ways you can identify AM radio signals in the HF bands when you're listening with a sideband radio is that you can hear the carrier frequency. And if you continue to tune, so you pick up just the one sideband, guess what you get? You get the audio reproduced.
You get the audio. Yep.
Okay.
Well, sorry to the group for
no, that's
hanging
why
us back a little bit.
we're doing this, is so you can ask these questions. So an AM signal has the advantage that it has both sidebands. Of course, because it has both sidebands, it's wider and it takes up more space. And it has both sidebands and the carrier frequency down the middle. So if you look at what they're showing here, this one is going from 797 kilohertz to 803 kilohertz. But the same information sent on sideband takes half the space. We don't need what's on the carrier. We can start at 800.3 and go to 803 even. And that's pretty fair representation. So the point they're trying to make here, this is not in the high-end bands, by the way. If the point I want to make here is we use half the information. We use half the signal width. There's another advantage of sideband I want you to kind of recognize. Can you guess what it is? Pertains to power. When you're transmitting out a transmitter, the whole wave you're generating, the whole signal, every part of it, all the sidebands, the carrier wave, and everything, they're sharing the power. In an AM signal, if you had a 1,000-watt signal, I'm going to leave this tuned right there, and I'm going to make another one. In an AM signal, and I'm going to make a bigger box to cover the whole thing. When you're transmitting, well, your transmitter is sharing all of its power across this entire spectrum. But in a sideband signal, when you're transmitting, your transmitter is sending all that power only in the space occupied by the sideband. Effectively, it's like folding this power over to, it's effectively like doubling the power that the information itself is being provided. So now, which one do you think travels further in weak or in noisy conditions? In weak signal conditions or noisy conditions, sideband's going to be able to punch through further.
Yeah, that higher frequency.
It's not the higher frequency, it's that there's more power in a smaller space of frequency and a smaller bandwidth. When I'm talking about the red area here, that's the whole bandwidth of an AM signal. That could be 6 kilohertz. A sideband signal doesn't carry the carrier or the one sideband, so it's around 2.6 or 2.5 kilohertz. It's like spreading out water from a hose. If the water's spraying out broad over a wide area, you get less drops in any one spot. But if you're shooting it very narrow, you get more range or more power going to each drop going out.
That
and
makes
never
sense.
overspray. Okay. All right. We're going to
Yeah,
go back.
thank you.
That's what I'm here to do. And it's a great question. If this was easy, I wouldn't have gone through all this drawing because I just could jump through the book. Nothing about this part is intuitive. And that's what I want you to come away with. I want you to understand that if it doesn't make sense, it's because it does. But the way that it makes sense involves some really complex mathematics to explain it. It's the way they came up with the idea of single sideband. AM was discovered pretty much the same way. And wait till we get to the next one. It gets more fun. So the next thing I'm going to talk about with you is frequency and phase modulation. In the VHF and UHF spectrum, it's the most commonly used mode of communications. Generally, FM radio, as we refer to it, although for the most part, the FM radios really don't exist today. And I'm going to explain to you why. FM modulation works by changing the frequency of the signal with the information. So we take the audio from a microphone, for example, an audio source, and instead of adjusting the power output, which is basically an amplifier stage of the transmitter, we adjust the tuning circuit or the oscillator of the transmitter, a oscillator. And by doing that, we make the frequency change, the actual frequency being transmitted change. Most FM that we hams use is 15 kilohertz wide. Yeah. So at that width, it is 5 times an AM signal wide. Broadcast FM can be 100 kilowatts wide. I'm sorry, kilohertz wide. Now, the amplitude remains the same. The power going out on the wave is constant. And here's 2 things I want you to remember. In AM, the amplitude changes constantly as you talk. And the frequency stays constant. In FM, and you're using the same width of signal in AM all the time, I'm sorry. In FM, your frequency is being changed by the audio. And here's the biggie. The power is always constant. Generally speaking, we think of an antenna on the back of a vehicle or something like this as being a vertical antenna like I'm drawing here. But it's not all by itself. It's actually 2 elements make up an antenna. In nature, in life, in everything else. In fact, I'm going to take my center line out of there just to make this less complicated. Brushes, draw, erase. All right, center line, I don't need you. I don't need you. And if I make this narrower, I don't need you. All right, so on the back of our car, and I'm not even going to try to draw a car, guys. I'm just going to put a little block in there. I'm going to make it fancy. But it's just going to be a little block like this. Move it over here. And I'm going to fill that in with some pretty color. It's a brown car. On the back of our car, we have a little antenna, right? Generally speaking, if we really want the antenna to work, we want an antenna to be a half-wave antenna. And we want that antenna to exist. Basically, the easiest way I can describe this, gosh darn it, I'm not doing great at this. We want this antenna. In fact, maybe it's easier to just draw one straight line. We want it to be a half-wave antenna because the wave will travel across it like I'm about to show you. Normally I draw this the other way, but we want it to travel something like this. At both ends of the antenna, we want the wave to be going through zero. Notice that the wave, this is our signal. Notice that the wave passes through zero at the end, zero at the bottom, and there's a 0 point in the middle. So electrically, that spot, it doesn't know. It doesn't really know 0 points, but this is the most efficient way the signal will leave is when at the ends, it's at the 0 point. If our antenna is too short for that, like this one is, so I'm going to make that antenna right next to it. Starts at the bottom of that truck and it comes up something like this. Okay. If that's too short, even if we put a coil on it, that wave is going to leave. Well, let's move over. That wave is going to leave somewhere where the voltage is very high. Might even start at zero. It might be, well, it might just well start at zero, but it's going to leave at a high point. That's not going to efficiently leave. Some of that wave is going to get reflected back down the antenna. That's called a reflected wave. When we measure that wave coming back compared to the wave going out, because that wave actually reflected back is coming back just like this, but backwards. We measure the forward and reverse wave as a standing wave ratio, the ratio of the forward wave to the reverse wave. We're going to cover this in the antennas, but I'm doing it now because it's a part of this that's important. In a shortened wave, we put a coil in here, and I'm going to represent that with a little box. And I'm just going to put a little box there, represent there's a little coil in the bottom of this wave. Put that right there. Now, by doing that, we electrically, not physically, make that antenna as if it's not this short line, but this line right here. But if you notice something, it's really kind of only half of the whole half wavelength would be ideal. Well, in a vertical antenna, we either have verticals in the ground, which are other wires, or we have the body of the automobile to act as this other half of the wave or antenna. And we refer to that as the counterpoise to a vertical antenna. In a dipole antenna, I'm going to show one horizontally, it could be vertical as well. We have two quarter wave segments, and then we connect our wires up like this. And this is what goes back, and we have a wave now that will efficiently leave this antenna all by its little lonesome self, something pretty. Because we're passing through zero at the center point. So it has no effect upon how the wave travels. Remember, the wave is electromagnetic. It's not just, it's a magnetic wave created by electrical field. Okay. I want to make that a pretty color. There we go. So this wave, and hopefully this wave, this is going to be tricky to draw, guys. This wave, well, imagine that the body of the car makes this portion as if it's further up. Okay, to compensate. Now, it's not a perfect arrangement, but it works good enough. But there's an important point that I got to bring up to you. When you introduce a coil like that, it limits the bandwidth of the antenna because it's really not this physically. It's really only this top part physically. And it's only part of the top part physically. So it actually has a wave that is departing, not in perfect alignment with the end of the physical end of the antenna. It is the electrical end of the antenna. I know that's confusing. So to the electrical signal, it appears to be all A-OK. But the voltage on these antennas can be rather high at the top. So to compensate for that, what they do is they put a little tiny ball at the top. Did you notice there's a little ball at the top of your antenna?
Absolutely.
That's an important little ball. That little ball stops lightning from flying off your antenna. Well, it really probably won't on a CB. It's not a lot of power there. But what it acts is as a Corolla ball, and it's there. We call them hat tops in ham radio. It's there because the voltage is not going to be perfect when you make a shorter antenna like this. Shortened antennas are a reality. The half wavelength for the 11-meter bands is 11 meters or 33 feet. You cannot drive around town with a 33-foot whip on the back of your antenna or car. The quarter wavelength is, it's about half that. It's not, wait a minute, it's 27 meters. Yeah, it's 11 meters. It's about 33 feet, somewhere around that. You can get almost close, and the whip is 100 and some odd inch whip that works for a quarter wave on CB. It works, but you can't park in your garage with that great big thing sticking up in the air. But don't feel bad. On 160 meters, that antenna mobile would have to be 160 meters high, which is 160 yards. That's a world of a long wire to put on the back of your truck or car. And hams used to work 160 meter mobile all the time. One of the advantages of the HF frequencies and VHF and UHF frequencies is their antennas get smaller. A half wave on, I'm sorry, a full wave, I said this wrong. Full wave is 11 meters. That's why the quarter wave is roughly 109 or 110 inches. I don't remember exactly. It's been years since I calculated that. On a quarter wave of like 2 meters, well, a full wave is 2 meters. One wave is a meter, which is about 3 feet. And so a quarter wave is close to 1.5 feet, about 18 inches. You can put 18-inch antenna just fine on your car. And at 440, that's only down to about 9 inches. You can do that real easy. On 1.2 gigs, it's down to like 2 inches. You know, so you can see the advantages for mobile to use smaller antennas and higher frequencies. All right, we're going to go back to the book, guys. Does this answer all that? How it works and why?
Yes, it does. And I didn't mean to derail things.
We're going to have to cover it anyway. But we're going to get back to modulation though. Because I'm going to push you guys right through the end of the class because of this. I'm punishing you. We're not going to take the last break. Kindle. Here we go. All right. So in FM, we were talking about modulation. In FM, we push or we control the tuning of the frequency we're on with the audio. And so it slightly moves the frequency up and down, the actual frequency you're transmitting when you transmit. So when we tune on an FM signal at, say, 144.5 megahertz, that signal can go up and down 15 kilohertz from that point. 15 kilohertz above and 15 kilohertz below 144.5 megahertz. Okay? So I know that you're going to have to play with the numbers, write it down and figure it out, but it'll become obvious as we go. So what we're doing is in FM, we're varying the frequency rather than the amplitude. FM, because of this, the FM detector has functions differently. In an FM radio receiver, the receiver doesn't behave like an AM receiver, although they're very similar circuits. Rather than just detect the signal, the FM signal is captured. And here's the difference. If two signals are received by an AM receiver, an AM radio, you'll hear them both kind of blending in with each other. But in FM, it captures a signal. And what it will do is it will only capture one, the strongest one. So FM detection has a capture effect. Gosh, excuse me. And it gives us some great advantages, which we use all the time for purposes of like repeaters and clear signal reception. Because if you capture a signal and no others, as long as you got that signal, it's nice, clear, and steady. And the sound is quiet. There's nothing else interfering. It will only hear what it's capturing for the most part. Lightning crashes are an exception. Because of that, we can put a squelch circuit, which is a means of filtering out any uncaptured signal. We can put a squelch circuit on an FM radio, and it's dead quiet. There's no sound, no noise, nothing going on in the background until somebody brings up a radio and starts talking, and the signal gets captured. So I'm not going to go through these questions because we get to them on the questions coming up. All right. Now, I talked to you earlier about bandwidths of signals, and this chart 5.1 or table 5.1, that chart is handy. Remember I told you CW is the narrows because just the wave itself, it's only about 150 hertz wide. Okay. Now, a sideband signal is somewhere between 500 and 300 hertz wide, or I go by about three kilohertz wide. What that's of course talking about digital, but the voice averages somewhere around 2 to 2.6, 3 when somebody's really splattering. Now, voice AM phone is 6 kilohertz wide. Doesn't change. The amplitude changes, not the width, right? AM fast scan TV, which is a TV you see like broadcast TV, except this is the narrower version that we hams use. If we want to do two-way TV, it occupies 6 megahertz. Look at an AM signal, 6 kilohertz, 6 megahertz is 1,000 times greater. So this signal is actually 6,000 kilohertz wide. In other words, you can get 6,000 AM broadcasts or AM transmissions in a TV signal. In a TV signal, you can get 12,000 single sideband communications in the same space. Give or take a little bit of, give or take 10 or 15 or so. Might need a little extra spacing, but you know what I mean. All right, FM voice. Well, FM voice, like we use as hams, is 15 kilohertz wide, almost 3 times the width of an AM signal, because it has to fluctuate up and down. But there is a narrowband FM that's about 5 or 6 kilohertz wide. Commercial users have it. It really restricts the vocal range of the FM communications. And they sound pretty nasal and a little distorted because of it, but you get used to it after a while. But look below that. Remember I told you an AM signal is 6 kilohertz wide. That's true whether it's a ham radio communication or whether it's a full reproduction audio stereo on AM, because it's amplitude. But a broadcast FM station has to, because it's modulation, has to cover the entire audio spectrum. It has to be able to reproduce the lowest notes to the highest notes. It reproduces at 150 kilohertz wide. In other words, 10 of our repeaters can fit in the space that one FM broadcast signal occupies. And of course, commercial TV is back where it is fast scan TV. So yeah, it occupies thousands, like I said, of not only thousands or the space of thousands of phone communications. Well, let's get down to brass tacks here. Remember I told you to occupy 1,000 the space of 1,000 AM signals. It'll about 2,000 single sideband stations. Well, you get down to Morse code. I think if you do the math, it's phenomenal how many Morse code signals will fit in the space of one TV broadcast station. Because if you divide 6 million by 150, you get a pretty big number. In fact, why not? 6 million divided, you can't see that, 150. 40,000 Morse code communiques can go on in the space of a single television transmission. Good to know. You don't have to know them in great detail, but it helps put things in perspective, does it not? All right, we're moving on. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is digital signals. We have several forms of digital communications. The most fundamental is Morse code. We also have digital techniques that use the same principles of Morse code, but they send forms of teletype like ASCII. The short and long represents on and off, and the on and offs represent by timing a digital signal. It represents a digital character, I mean, and by our digital number, I'm sorry, and the binary number added up together becomes a character, and that character gets displayed on a screen, and you have teletype. It's pretty complicated, but it works. And when we're dealing with signals like that, when we're dealing with just simple on and offs, the ear can do it very, very well. But the computer has a heck of a time with it. We have beautiful ears. For most raw ASCII communications, ASCII is the now international, but originally amateur or American standard keyboard 2, ASKII. ASCII are a set of characters developed for teletype to replace Morse code for telegrams. The machines that used to do it had to have a means of locking in the signal when they were on the air, pinpoint precise. And to this day, tuning the signal is critical. So digital techniques came along to improve on that. Digital techniques started including things like a protocol, which defined what the signal should look like. And they had things like they included checksums and timing spacing information so that the sending station included that information electronically along with the information, and the computer can compensate. And so it's easier to tune digital signals. So your book starts, I'm going to go start here. IQ modulation, which is a term we use for some digital communications, more advanced. As more digital signals appeared on the amateur band, it says, and this is very true, you hear about IQ modulation. The term I and Q stand for in phase and quadrature, which refers to a pair of signals that make the final signal. Now, what we have is instead of an unmodulated on-off creating digits, numbers, and then the numbers being translated to characters, we send the ASCII characters as a modulated tone, usually sideband or FM, and it has two sound waves, an I and a Q. You can think of it that way. It's a pretty easy way to do it. And the two waves, the two signals, carry the information of, because one is the high or on, and the other audio represents the off. I'm oversimplifying, but I'm going to make this easier to grasp, okay? Because there's complex protocols behind some of these that's phenomenal. Doing this together with checksums and digital circuitry and some clever programming, we have amazing digital modes. The first of which, the earliest of which, was probably packet radio. In packet radio, amateurs got the idea that we would break up every message into 64 characters. We would group 64 characters and transmit them digitally with an audio I and Q signal, one being the 0, one being the the other signal being the 1. And that would send the digital information. We would include timing information that let the signal know, or let the receiver know, how long it should expect spaces between characters and so on. It's a little more complex than that, but it's a good way to look at it. And we would send a verification number which related mathematically to what was in those 64 characters. Imagine this. This is not exactly right, but it's close. Imagine you got a character in ASCII, or it's an actual number that's being sent. You can't send an L. You send the number that correlates to L. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what it is, but I think A is 48, so 49 would be C or B. For 50 would be C, and so on. Sends that number. Well, now if you send a whole bunch of 64 numbers, if you added them all together and you sent the total, this was an early technique. It's more complex today in many protocols. So at the end of the transmission, after you sent all the characters, you sent a number. We call that a checksum number. That number is all the values added together. The station at the other end, when it was receiving all the numbers, could add them all up. And if they were all the same, it could then just transmit a signal back to the transmitter. Okay, send me the next batch. And then it could display on a computer screen what the characters were. But if it was wrong, because it missed the number because of something gone wrong on the air, it would do up the math at the end, or if it didn't get the checksum number, it would send back I didn't get that all right. And the original station would send it over again, all automatically, electronically. Doesn't take but a fraction of a second to do all this. And so back and forth, it would get all the information, and you would just see it on the screen displaying. You would hear blurps if you listen to the audio. It'd kind of go, kind of a blurpy sound. But all that information was transmitting and being verified back and forth. And today's digital modes do variations of that idea. So, and today's digital modes can use either sideband on the HF bands or FM on the VHF and UHF bands. There's one more type of FM I want to talk about real quickly, and that's or digital, I mean, real quickly. And that's today we also have digital audio. Digital audio is different than digital text in that what is done is in the radio, there's a computer that digitizes, samples the audio, digitizes it into numbers, values, Then the digital values are sent just the way those characters are sent, pretty much. And at the other end, the receiver radio receives those numbers, checks and verifies the checksum, and translates that back into the audio that was sent to begin with. It undigitizes it or reconstructs it. Digital audio is becoming very, very popular in FM because it really reproduces sounds nicely. But in digital audio, if your receiver doesn't get most of the packets or most of the packages of the digital signal sent, it gets it distorted. It doesn't translate well. If you've ever watched TV online or on digital cable and you see the pattern get all different colors, it distorts, like blocks out what you're supposed to see. That's what happens when that happens in TV and audio. It starts to sound like the guy's underwater when he's talking to you, and then it gets horribly distorted and gone. So digital signal, weak digital signal does not work well. But strong digital signals is phenomenal. In fact, of all of them, I might be a little biased here, but C4 FM from Yaesu is phenomenal. When you listen to that audio, it sounds like the guy you're talking to is sitting right next to you. It's a little freaky when you're driving along in a car and the audio is that clear and crisp, because sometimes it can make you look for a ghost. It really does sound that strong. All right. Transmitters and receivers, 5.2. I'm going to jump ahead and generally speaking, as ham radio operators today, we don't use separate transmitters and receivers. We use transceivers. But inside a transceiver is both a transmitter and a receiver combined with switching circuits so that one will operate when you want to receive, and then when you push the talk microphone or engage a Morse code key, they will switch off the receiver and allow you to transmit. That prevents damage to the receiver, by the way. Whether you're going to buy a handheld or whether you buy a mobile or set up a station at home, principles of radios are the same. And I'm not going to give you this chart. We're going to do that another time. We're going to come back to that part. So, radios themselves, while they come in all shapes, and flavors, we're going to cover that a little bit. I'm going to deviate from the text now. You can buy multi-mode radios. You can buy radios for your station at home that cover every amateur band you could probably ever dream of. I wouldn't do that. I don't like put all my eggs in one basket, but you can't. It costs a lot of money, but it might be worth it. You can also buy mobile radios and handheld radios that are mono band, just have like HF or UHF band, or maybe dual band with two different bands, or maybe 3, 4, 5 for some mobiles. Problem is, if you're going to get a multi-band mobile and radio, you'll need a multi-band mobile antenna, and more than likely more than one antenna. But practically speaking, the range, the variety of radios out there are phenomenal. Now, your book, I'm going to cover this in the next class. Your book doesn't tell you what I want to cover for you now. So we're going to go back to the drawings and go back to Nick's fancy drawings. I think I'll save this. Be a nice save for future classes. I hope it didn't. And I'll go back to Nick's favorite way of now erasing. When you pick up a handheld radio or a mobile radio, and we're going to cover things like repeaters and so on a little more in the future. But when you buy a radio, it's going to cover a certain piece of spectrum. You're going to need an antenna that matches it, just like I talked earlier. And that's why I wasn't afraid to jump into it. We're going to need a antenna that antenna discussion earlier goes along with. But you are going to initially be technicians, and you're going to have a limited, maybe I have this. Maybe I have this already drawn. I guess not. They don't. Okay. It helps if you understand what's going on, though, inside that radio. And so I want to cover this. It's not in your book. I want to cover it. Okay. And I'm going to do it in little block diagrams. Okay. This will work. Start with a fancy one, looks like this. In a transmitter, the first thing we have to do is we have to generate the frequency. We do this in a circuit we call an oscillator. I'm just doing block diagrams here because this is a convenient way to grasp things. So the first thing we have is an oscillator. Now, from that oscillator, we take that signal, and now we got to do something with it. Well, let me get simple. In a Morse code setup. Well, no, before we go Morse code, let's go fundamental. In a just tone generator carrier circuit, we would amplify this signal. This would be the amplifier. No, this is not cooperating. Wonder why. Let's try this again. Let's put an amp right there. That works for me. All right. We amplify that signal so it's strong enough to go somewhere. And then, being greedy people that we hams are, we would take that signal, and I guess I got to draw this by hand. Something in this is not set up the way I wanted to, but I will live with it. Then we just hook that up to a antenna. There's my antenna. And what would come out from this antenna? Here we go. Is a wave. And it'd be a constant tone. Except that we wouldn't hear it. It would just be a wave, electromagnetic noise. If we tuned it with certain radios, we'd hear a tone. In Morse code, we make this just like this, but this amplifier has to have power fed to it. So we can turn this amp on and off because it's got to have wires to hook up to it. Yeah, we'll take a pen, pencil. So if this is the power line going to the amplifier, it didn't work. All right. Why we could we want to run that to a battery. So I'm going to just put a shape in here to be the battery. We got to power that amp. We got some power source. And in Morse code, we put a key here so that we can transmit. We tap the key, turns on and off the amplifier, and the wave turns on and off. Okay. In AM radio, need my brush again. Need the eraser. We just replace this with the audio signal. Now, it doesn't turn the amplifier off and on. It adds more or less power to the amplifier when we put a microphone or a wave audio signal in. So again, I'm just going to block diagram. Just going to put a shape in here to represent that we've got another waveform. Oh, come on. We got another waveform, which in this case is audio, in between. That audio is controlling the amps, and that's controlling the amps amplitude, how loud or soft it is. And now we've got AM modulation going up. But if we eliminate this part and we leave that amp run all the time, but now we put that audio stage to change the tune of the oscillator. It's pretty fancy here, guys. Don't remember what I used for that audio, but I think this was it. So now we have that wave, that audio wave, adjusting the oscillator, not the amplifier. That's how the FM is made in your receiver, or sorry, transmitter. This is important as a block concept to understand because you can actually look at block diagrams of radios and see what stages do this. But there's some things I need to fill in. We don't actually use the actual frequency coming off your microphone. We might put a stage in between, and whether it's AM or FM, doesn't matter. We'll put a stage in between that changes the frequency. We do those with something called either a mixer, well, this part that brings it in the form of a mixer, the audio coming in is and changing the frequency is a mixer. And the way that a mixer works is when you combine two signals, you get the difference you get the difference of the two signals, or you get the two signals added together. Whichever one you want to advance, you let go on. Whatever you don't want, you filter out. So after you've mixed these signals together, you've got a new signal, and that's what the FM is controlled by. In an AM signal, we actually mix in with the drive of the power of the amplifier. on these frequencies in the middle are called intermediate frequencies, or IF. And there are many stages, and this is a simplified drawing. There may be several amplifier stages. There may be several mixers, and you start at one frequency and they add others, mix them, filter out, and they end up with the frequency you want going on. I know this sounds like a lot of crazy stuff. Why the engineers do that have a lot to do with in between each stage, they can get rid of unnecessary noise. And they can clean things up and they can amplify things without repeating them. Remember, if you amplify, when you amplify, you also amplify not only the signals you want, but the signals you don't want. So by doing these things in stages beforehand, they can eliminate things they don't want more readily and then end up where they want to get. That's what's in your radios. That's what's transmitting for you. On the receive side, it's a little more complex. I will cover that because we're going to cover receivers in a bit. But I hope this kind of ties it all together on transmitters and modulation, because that's the key thing of today's class.